Hello, I'm Michael, and if you're here, it's because you're as attracted to fear as I am. In a forgotten little town in rural Tennessee, there was a Subway that was open 24 hours a day. Located in a gas station on the side of the road, the store was a stopping point for truck drivers and night travelers crossing the region. The building was old, with walls that still bore the marks of decades past. The place had an uncomfortable atmosphere, something that seemed to hide in the shadows of the high ceiling. Despite this, Subway was always relatively busy, even in the strangest hours of the morning. That night, the night shift was managed by 3 employees. Katie, a college student who worked to pay the bills, James, the exhausted manager who had stayed to cover an extra shift, and Amber, a newly hired young woman, nervous in her first week. That night, the usual tranquility was interrupted. At 3:12 a.m., a strong storm took over the region. The winds howled and heavy rain pounded the store windows, drowning out the few sounds that came from the road. Outside, the sign light flickered erratically, and the feeling that something was wrong seemed to grow by the minute. Amber commented that the store looked different that night, but James ignored her, focused on counting the cash at the register. Katie was in the back, restocking ingredients. Then at 3:33 a.m., something strange happened. At 3:33 a.m., Subway's fluorescent lights began flickering, emitting a strange buzzing sound that echoed off the walls. James, in front of the counter, looked up, frowning. He was about to call Katie and Amber to check the circuit breaker when the storm outside grew more intense. Lightning struck something nearby, causing the energy to waver for a moment before stabilizing. But when the light steadied, something seemed different. The reflection in the glass of the front window showed the store as normal, but a dark, humanoid figure could be seen in the background, standing in the bathroom hallway. James blinked, believing it was just his imagination. When he looked again, the figure had disappeared. Amber, who was at the counter replacing the bread, felt something strange behind her. The air felt colder, and she had the feeling she was being watched. When he turned around, he saw nothing, but one of the chairs in the dining area was out of place, as if it had been moved. She tried to ignore it and go back to work, but the discomfort grew. Katie came out from the back carrying a tray of vegetables, muttering about how the freezer was making a strange noise. As she passed the bathroom aisle, she noticed something on the floor, wet footprints, as if someone had walked through the store barefoot. She shouted to James, asking if any customers had come in unnoticed, but he denied it, saying that no one had come through the door for almost an hour. Amber looked at her watch and realized it was exactly 3:45. The footprints appeared to lead to the men's bathroom, the door of which was ajar. A dim light flickered inside. James went to check, while Amber and Katie waited near the counter, restless. When James opened the door fully, the bathroom was empty. However, on the mirror above the sink, there was something written. The words were blurred, as if they had been made from condensed steam, but the message was clear: don't leave. James wiped the mirror quickly, trying to ignore the warning. He assumed it was some joke from previous customers and returned to the main area, telling the girls there was nothing to worry about. But as he spoke, the store's lights began to flicker again. Little by little, the buzzing in the wires became louder, almost deafening. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, but there was no one but them there. Amber noticed something strange on the security camera monitors. The recordings showed images that didn't make sense. In the upper right corner, the dining area appeared to be full of people sitting around, but when looking at the same area in the actual store, it was completely empty. The figures on the monitors did not move normally. Their heads were lowered, as if they were waiting for something. At 4 a.m. sharp, the storm outside stopped abruptly. The silence was almost as unsettling as the noise. Then, a loud knock came from the front door. Amber screamed, but James tried to remain calm. He slowly approached the door, but saw no one outside, just the deserted road and the dim light of the sign flashing on the roof of the gas station. As he turned to go back to the counter, he saw a figure in the reflection of the glass. She was standing in the middle of the store, looking directly at him. But when he turned to the spot, there was no one there. Katie felt something tug lightly on her shirt, but when she looked, Amber was on the other side of the store. The 3 people began to realize that they were not alone. Amber, still looking at the monitors, saw something that made her blood run cold. One of the reflected figures began to raise its head. Her eyes were empty, completely black, but she could feel that she was being watched. Out of nowhere, the figure on the monitor disappeared, but a chair in the dining area fell over, as if it had been knocked over with force. James picked up the phone to call the police, but the device was dead. When he tried to leave the store, the automatic door did not open, even after turning the system off and on again. Amber looked at her watch again. It was 4:13 a.m. Time seemed to be moving slower. Katie found something strange behind the counter, a box of old documents that shouldn't be there. Among dusty papers were records of the land where Subway had been built. She discovered that, years before, it had been the site of a series of truck driver disappearances, which were never solved. The name of one of the missing drivers was scrawled repeatedly on one of the papers: Jeremy Lane. Amber pointed to the monitor and said that the badge of one of the customers on the security cameras had the same name. The clock said 4:20 a.m. when everything in the store suddenly changed. The deafening sound of electrical buzzing ceased, leaving absolute silence. However, the calm brought no relief. On the contrary, it brought a feeling that something was about to happen. Amber looked at the monitors again, but the images from the security cameras were completely static. In the upper right corner, a message flashed repeatedly: error, NO signal. However, on the main screen, the dining area still showed the seated figures, now with their heads raised high, as if they were waiting. Katie began to feel a heaviness in the air, as if something invisible was pressing against the room. The temperature plummeted, and the glass in the windows began to fog up. On the counter, damp stains began to appear on the surfaces, slowly forming words. One of them was clear: you can't leave. James decided to try one more time to leave the store. He went to the automatic door and tried to force it open. The glass felt too firm, as if it were welded to the frame. When he knocked against the door, a crack appeared, but not in the glass, in the reflection itself. The crack spread like a spider's web across the store's reflection. Every second, the cracks revealed something strange behind the glass. It wasn't the gas station outside, but an opaque darkness filled with figures that seemed to move slowly. James took a shocked step back as Katie and Amber approached. The crack continued to grow until the reflected glass began to fall in pieces to the floor, revealing the darkness behind the door. When James touched the broken glass on the floor, he felt an intense cold run down his arm, followed by a distant sound, like footsteps coming from the darkness outside. In the center of the store, near the dining area, the chairs began to move on their own, dragging themselves to form a perfect circle. In the middle of the circle, the ground began to crack, revealing a darkness below that seemed alive. Amber started to panic, but Katie tried to keep her calm. James, still shocked, watched as something began to emerge from the crack in the floor. It was a tall, disproportionate figure, with long, thin arms and a head that seemed twisted at an impossible angle. The figure did not appear to walk. She floated lightly above the ground, and her face had no visible features. Just an open mouth, which seemed to emit the sounds of footsteps, laughter, and whispers at the same time. Amber shouted as she looked back at the monitors. Now the figures on the monitors were standing, looking directly at the camera. Their shapes were human, but their heads were dark, as if they were solid shadows. When she looked at the actual store area, they were there too, standing motionless, surrounding the group. James tried to speak to them, but the figures didn't react. They simply stood there, like guardians of something bigger. The floating figure in the center began to whisper words that seemed to echo in everyone's minds, even if no one could understand them. Katie, still holding the papers she had found, noticed something disturbing. Among the documents, there was a list of names, all the missing people who had passed through the land. But what caught his eye was Amber's name, which was listed along with a date, that very night. Amber started to cry, feeling like something was moving inside her. She fell to her knees, hands on the floor, as her reflection in the remaining glass on the counter began to move independently of her. The circle on the ground began to glow a deep red. The floating figure reached out towards Amber, while the figures in the shadows began to slowly approach. James tried to pull her out of the circle, but was thrown back by an invisible force. Katie tried to destroy the papers, believing that perhaps they were the connection to what was happening. However, when the papers touched the floor, they disappeared, leaving only a small symbol engraved on the floor, a triangle with a circle around it. Amber, now in the center of the circle, was lifted into the air by the floating figure. His screams echoed throughout the restaurant, but they didn't seem to come from his mouth, but from all sides at once. At 4:44 a.m., the store was filled with a flash of intense light, followed by absolute silence. When Katie opened her eyes, Amber and James were gone. The circle on the floor was intact, but the crack in the door was gone. The store seemed normal again, as if nothing had happened, but Katie knew that was just an illusion. Katie was alone at Subway. The silence was oppressive, and everything around him seemed frozen in time. The chairs that had moved to form the circle were back in their normal positions. The cracked floor was perfectly smooth, and the entrance sign glowed with a steady light. However, James and Amber's absence was a cruel reminder that nothing was normal. The clock on the wall said 4:45. The hands didn't move. Katie felt a knot in her stomach, as if time had been stuck in that moment. The only thing that seemed alive was the air around her, heavy and pulsing, as if something invisible was watching her every move. Katie, trying to understand what was happening, picked up the papers that Amber had dropped before disappearing. Among them was an old map of the land where the restaurant was built. It showed the original layout, with a warning written in large letters at the bottom. The foundation is the seal. She noticed that the circle on the ground where Amber disappeared was directly over what the map identified as the center point of the seal. Something had been locked there, and now it seemed about to escape. Katie looked around, feeling the store change again. The light started to flash, but this time there was a pattern. The flashes illuminated the walls in sequence, guiding her towards the back hallway, where the storage room and office were located. When Katie entered the hallway, something was different. It seemed longer than it should have been. The doors on both sides were locked, and the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. With each step, the sound of his feet echoed strangely, as if the space around him was larger than it actually was. The smell of something burning began to fill the air, and the walls began to darken, as if they were being consumed by ash. At the end of the hallway, Katie found a door she had never seen before. It was made of heavy metal, with deep scratch marks. Engraved in the center was the same symbol she had seen on the store floor, a triangle with a circle around it. When Katie pushed the door open, it opened with a deafening creak. On the other side, there was a spiral staircase that descended into the darkness. The air was even colder here, and the steps looked ancient, as if they hadn't been used in decades. Katie slowly went downstairs, using her cell phone as a flashlight. The surrounding walls were covered in symbols similar to those she had seen before, but now they were accompanied by words in a language she didn't recognize. Upon reaching the end of the stairs, she entered a large, empty room. In the center, there was a stone pedestal where a broken mirror rested. The cracks in the glass formed the same pattern as the symbol on the floor and door. As Katie approached, she saw something terrible. In the mirror's reflection, she was not alone. The shadow figures stood behind her, motionless but clearly watching. In the center of the reflection, Amber and James were trapped, their expressions frozen in a silent scream. Katie tried to touch the mirror, but was repelled by a wave of energy that threw her back. The pedestal began to shake, and the sound of footsteps echoed throughout the room. The floating figure, which had taken Amber, emerged from the darkness. His movements were erratic, and his presence made the entire room vibrate. She floated towards the mirror and began touching it, as if trying to break through the final barrier that was keeping her trapped. Katie realized she needed to stop the entity from destroying the seal, but she didn't know how. It was then that she saw an inscription engraved on the pedestal: "Sacrifice is the key." She understood the meaning but hesitated. If he destroyed the mirror, he could seal the entity again, but Amber and James would also be lost forever. The entity turned to Katie, extending an arm toward her. His presence was overwhelming, and Katie felt her mind being invaded by images of pain and despair. But in the midst of the chaos, she found strength. Picking up a rock from the ground, Katie hit the mirror with all her strength. The glass shattered in an explosion of light, and the room began to collapse. The entity let out a deafening scream before being pulled into the pedestal, disappearing completely. Katie ran back up the stairs as the ground shook, barely able to keep her balance. When she reached the top, the metal door closed behind her, and the hallway returned to its normal state. Katie entered Subway again. Everything was as it should be. The lights were steady, the floor was clean, and the clock on the wall said 5 o'clock on the dot. But James and Amber were nowhere to be found. The store was empty, and the feeling that something had changed forever hung in the air. When Katie walked out into the parking lot, the storm had died down, but she felt like she was still being watched. Dawn was breaking over the horizon, casting a faint light on the gas station and the subway. Katie was in the parking lot, looking at the storefront, which from the outside looked completely normal. But she knew there was nothing ordinary about the place. The silence around was absolute. There were no sounds of cars on the road or the wind in the trees. It was as if the world had held its breath. Katie took out her cell phone, but the screen was dead, with no reception. Before leaving, Katie looked inside the subway one last time. Through the windows, everything seemed to be in order. The chairs were in place, the counter was spotless, and the lights shone as brightly as ever. But something caught his attention. In the reflection of the glass door, she saw Amber and James. They were sitting in the dining area, motionless, looking at her with expressions of despair. As Katie approached, the reflection disappeared, leaving only the empty interior of the store. She knew that somehow they were still trapped there. Driving down the road, Katie began to reflect on the events. The explosion of the mirror should have sealed the entity, but something inside said that the cycle had not ended. Amber and James weren't the first victims, and they probably wouldn't be the last. Katie tried to forget, but days later, while watching the news, she saw an article about Subway. The reporter mentioned that the store had closed without explanation, with the owners alleging structural problems in the building. However, rumors began to circulate about strange events occurring there at night. One night, as Katie was getting ready for bed, something strange happened. She was brushing her teeth when she noticed a reflection in the bathroom mirror. For a moment, she saw the floating figure standing behind her, but when she turned around, there was no one. Katie felt a chill run down her spine and realized that the subway mirror wasn't unique. Perhaps there were other objects connected to that entity, scattered around seemingly ordinary places, waiting for new victims. She turned off the bathroom light, but the reflection stuck in her mind. A few weeks later, in a distant city, a new subway opened. Customers loved the rustic design and antique furniture, including a large mirror that sat in the entryway. No one knew where the mirror came from, but it became an attraction for visitors. Over time, rumors began of strange events, whispers in the early morning silence, reflections that didn't match people's movements, and occasionally disappearances. The cycle continued. Before we go any further, if you like my content like the video, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments what time you dare to listen to these macabre stories. Now, without more interruptions, let's move on to the next story. On the side of a deserted road in New Mexico, there was a 24-hour subway known for its isolated location and strange reputation. For drivers and truck drivers traveling through the region, it was a convenient stopping point, but many avoided the place during the early hours of the morning. Among the local rumors was talk of disappearances and unexplained events associated with the restaurant. That night, 3 employees were on the night shift: Alex, the veteran manager, who just wanted to end the night without any problems; Jess, a college student who worked to pay the bills; and Mark, a new hire trying to impress his boss. The night was strangely calm, with only the occasional customer appearing between long periods of absolute silence. At 2:30 in the morning, the calm was broken. A customer entered, a tall man dressed in simple clothes and a jacket that seemed out of place in the hot weather. He didn't say anything as he entered. He just walked to a table in the corner and sat down, looking at the clock on the wall. Jess went to serve him, but when she got to the table, she noticed he was no longer there. The chair was still slightly pulled back, as if he had just gotten up. Looking around, there was no sign that he had left. Mark joked that Jess was imagining things, but Alex didn't laugh. He looked at the clock on the wall, which showed 2:33, and felt an inexplicable shiver. An uneasy feeling hung over the restaurant as Alex checked the security cameras to confirm the man had left. To his surprise, the recording showed something disturbing. The man entered the restaurant but never left. He would simply disappear from the screen after passing through an area that had no cameras. Alex tried to reassure Jess and Mark that it was probably a technical issue. However, as he looked closer, he noticed something even stranger. The clock visible in the corner of the video stopped at exactly 2:33 a.m., at the moment the man disappeared. Meanwhile, Jess noticed something unusual in the dining area. One of the tables appeared to be wet, but when she went to clean it, the liquid had a reddish color and a metallic smell, similar to blood. When he looked closer, he realized that there was no visible crack or source where it could have come from. At 2:45 a.m., the fluorescent lights began flickering, emitting a loud buzzing sound that reverberated throughout the restaurant. Mark went to the power panel in the back to check the circuit breaker, but when he opened the door, he found something that made him immediately back away. The room in the painting was completely dark, even with the flashlight on his cell phone illuminating the space. The walls, which were once smooth concrete, were now covered in scratch marks, as if something had tried to break out. Back in the main area, Jess saw something that stopped her in her tracks. In the reflection of the glass in the showcase, The man who had disappeared was sitting at the same table as before, looking directly at her. But when she turned around, the table was empty. As Alex tried to understand what was happening, Mark returned from the warehouse, visibly shaken. He started to tell what he saw, but before he could finish, the clock on the wall stopped working. An absolute silence took over the restaurant. None of the three dared to move until they heard a loud banging sound against the front door. When they looked, they saw a dark figure outside. The silhouette was unmistakable. It was the man who had disappeared. He was motionless, just staring inside, as the subway sign light blinked frantically. Alex went to the door to confront him, but when he opened it, there was no one there. Just the sound of the wind crossing the empty parking lot. When Alex went back inside, he noticed something was different. The restaurant seemed to have changed subtly. The tables were arranged unevenly, as if they had been moved. The lights seemed dimmer, and the air felt heavier. Jess looked at the clock again, but it still read 2:33. She checked her phone, and it showed the same time. Mark tried to use the restaurant's landline, but the line was completely dead. From that moment on, the three realized that something had trapped them inside the restaurant. As they tried to find a way out, a sound of footsteps echoed through the dining area. The footsteps were slow but steady, as if someone was walking directly towards them. However, there was no one in sight. When Alex looked at the security cameras again, he saw the images distort. For a brief moment, he saw something that made him freeze. The three of them were on the screen, but in the background, the man was standing behind them, looking directly into the camera. He immediately turned around to check the actual location, but there was no one there. At 3 a.m. sharp, or at least according to their cell phones, since the clock was still stopped, the restaurant began to transform. The walls began to darken, and damp spots appeared on the ceiling. The smell of iron filled the air, and the sound of footsteps was replaced by something more disturbing, a low, drawling laugh that seemed to echo from all directions. Jess saw her own image reflected in the glass of the window, but the reflection didn't follow her. Instead, he smiled in a distorted way, as if he were a corrupted version of herself. Mark tried to open the automatic doors, but the glass seemed solid as stone. He began to knock desperately, but the knocks echoed as if they were coming from inside the restaurant, not from where he was standing. In the back, Alex found an old record of the restaurant, something that looked like it had been left behind during the construction of the place. There was a small newspaper clipping attached to the log, mentioning a series of disappearances there before the subway was built. A hand-scribbled sentence at the end of the document caught his attention. The road leads to eternal hunger. Before he could share what he found, the lights went out completely, leaving the group in darkness. The restaurant was plunged into total darkness. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by Jess and Mark's heavy breathing. Alex, still holding the newspaper clipping and old record, felt a chill run down his spine. Something was wrong with the place, and he knew it wasn't just a coincidence. As they tried to find their way in the darkness, the lights flickered again, but this time erratically, only intermittently illuminating parts of the restaurant. The shadows on the walls began to move unnaturally, as if they had a life of their own. As the lights flickered, Mark saw something in the corner of his vision. A dark, motionless silhouette standing near the refrigerator area. He tried to shout to the others, but his voice seemed to catch in his throat. When the lights flickered again, the silhouette was gone. But instead, the refrigerator doors began to open and close on their own, the sound echoing through the empty restaurant. Jess looked at the glass of the front door and saw reflections that didn't make sense. Instead of showing the inside of the restaurant, the reflection showed the road outside, but the landscape was distorted, as if something was moving beneath the surface of the asphalt. The clock on the wall began to spin rapidly, the hands moving at impossible speeds while the dial gave off a low, steady hum. When it finally stopped, it read 3:33 again. Alex realized that time was trapped in a cycle, forcing them to relive the same moments over and over again. He tried to open the back door, but when he turned the handle, he was greeted by something completely unexpected. Instead of leading to the parking lot, the door led to a long, narrow hallway with concrete walls and a red light shining in the background. He called Jess and Mark, who reluctantly followed him. The corridor seemed to go on forever. Every step they took was accompanied by an echo that sounded much louder than it should have. The walls seemed to move, pulsing slightly as if they were alive. Jess began to feel a strong pressure in her head, as if something was trying to invade her thoughts. She saw flashes of disturbing images, the man who had disappeared from the restaurant, sitting in a chair, but his hands were deformed, elongated, and had fingers that looked like claws. Mark began to hear whispers coming from the walls. They called her name over and over in familiar but distorted voices, as if they were being dragged out of another world. At the end of the corridor was a small, circular room, lit by the same red light. In the center of the room, a stone pedestal supported a metal tray. In it, there was something that looked like a sandwich, but the meat inside was pulsing, as if it were alive. Alex realized that this wasn't food, it was a trap. He tried to stop Jess from approaching, but she seemed drawn to the tray, as if she were hypnotized. When she reached out to touch it, a giant shadow emerged from the walls, enveloping the entire room. The shadow took shape, revealing himself as the man they had seen before. But now he was deformed, his jaw disproportionate and open in a macabre grin, exposing sharp teeth that did not belong to a human being. The figure advanced towards Jess, its footsteps making the ground shake. Alex and Mark tried to pull her away, but she seemed paralyzed, unable to take her eyes off the creature. When the shadow reached her, she was lifted into the air like a puppet, her body shaking violently. Jess started to scream, but her voice was drowned out by the whispers filling the hallway. The creature tilted its head, watching Alex and Mark as if it were judging them. Then, in a sudden movement, she disappeared into the darkness, taking Jess with her. The hallway was silent again, but the creature's presence could still be felt. Alex and Mark ran back down the hall, but when they opened the door, they found the restaurant completely different. The walls were covered in claw marks, and the floor was soaked with the same reddish liquid that Jess had found earlier. The tables and chairs were overturned, as if a fight had taken place, and the air was heavy, making it difficult to breathe. In the center of the restaurant, the same metal tray from the hallway was on a table, but now there were 3 sandwiches, each with a name engraved on the side: Jess, Mark, and Alex. Mark started to panic, but Alex knew this was more than a warning. It was an invitation. The lights started to go out one by one, leaving only the tray lit up. The man's shadow reappeared, but this time he was not alone. Other figures appeared around him, all appearing to be distorted reflections of the restaurant staff, their features contorted into expressions of agony. The shadow pointed at Alex and Mark, and the figures began to slowly advance towards them. Mark tried to fight, but was dragged to the floor by invisible hands, which pulled him towards the tray. Alex tried to save him, but the strength of the shadows was overwhelming. When Mark disappeared, Alex was left alone, staring at the tray with the remaining sandwich. He knew this wasn't just a meal, it was proof that he was next. Alex was alone in the restaurant, surrounded by shadows that seemed to pulse on the walls and the low, constant sound of whispers coming from all around him. The remaining sandwich on the tray seemed to glow in the dim light, an irresistible yet terrifying presence. He felt a wave of despair course through his body. Jess and Mark had been taken, and he knew he didn't have long before he was next. But something inside him, perhaps the survival instinct, forced him to act. The restaurant was no longer the same place he had known. The walls were covered in claw marks and symbols drawn in what looked like blood. The clock on the wall had completely disappeared, and the windows were blocked by dense darkness, as if the restaurant was floating in an absolute void. Alex looked around, looking for anything he could use to fight or escape. He found a piece of broken metal near the counter, probably part of a shelf that had been destroyed. He held onto it tightly, feeling that it was his only chance to survive. As he passed the glass in the storefront, Alex noticed that his reflection didn't move with him. In the reflection, he was sitting at the table, eating the remaining sandwich. The reflection looked directly at him and smiled macabrely before disappearing completely. He started to hear footsteps behind him, but every time he turned around, there was nothing there. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and he knew the shadows were moving, waiting for the right moment to strike. Alex remembered the door he had found in the back, the one that led to the endless hallway. He decided to return there, believing there might be a way out in the end. When he opened the door, the hallway was different. Now it was illuminated by a pulsating blue light, which seemed to come from a distant opening. He started walking, but with each step, the hallway seemed to get even longer. The walls were covered in symbols he didn't recognize, and the floor made a hollow sound, as if he were walking on something alive. At the end of the hallway, Alex found a circular room, similar to the one he had seen before. In the center, there was a stone pedestal with a large metal plate. Engraved on the plaque was a message: "The cycle must be maintained. Choose or perish." Around the pedestal, humanoid shadows began to emerge from the walls. They had no faces, but their movements were erratic, as if they were struggling to stay in the physical world. Alex realized that the shadows were reflections of the people who had been captured before him, perhaps even Jess and Mark. On the pedestal, two sandwiches appeared, one named Alex and one named Mark. He knew what that meant. The entity was offering a choice. He could eat the sandwich with Mark's name on it and ensure his own survival, but he would sacrifice Mark forever. If he refused, he knew they would both be condemned. The shadows began to approach, and the room became colder and colder. Alex picked up the sandwich with Mark's name on it, but hesitated. He knew that his choice was not just between living and dying. It was between keeping the cycle or breaking it, even if that meant the end. Alex, in an act of desperation, threw the sandwich on the floor and used the piece of metal to destroy the pedestal. When he did, the entire room began to shake. The shadows screamed, a horrible sound that seemed to tear the air. The ground beneath him began to crumble, and he was swallowed by darkness. When Alex opened his eyes, he was back in the restaurant. Everything was in order. The tables were set, the lights were shining normally, and the clock said 5 o'clock. But he was alone. Jess and Mark were nowhere to be found. He ran outside, finding the parking lot empty in the pale morning light. The road was silent, with no signs of movement. As he looked at the restaurant for the last time, he saw his own reflection in the glass door. But the reflection wasn't him. It was the shadowy figure that had haunted them all night. Alex realized that the cycle had not ended. He was now part of it. The rising sun cast a golden light on the empty desert surrounding the subway. But for Alex, the day didn't seem to bring relief. He stood in the parking lot, staring at the distorted reflection in the glass door. The shadowy figure staring back at him seemed to smile, a cold, evil smile that sent chills down his spine. When he finally managed to look away, he felt the crushing weight of the silence. There were no cars on the road, nor the usual sound of wind. It was as if the world around him was trapped in a bubble of stillness. Alex tried to call someone, but his phone didn't work. He returned to the restaurant, hoping to find some clue as to what had happened, but everything was exactly as it should be. The kitchen was clean, the tables were set, and the clock on the wall showed 6 a.m., moving normally. He checked the back of the restaurant, where the hallway had appeared, but was now just an ordinary door leading to an empty warehouse. However, as he approached the counter, he saw something that made his heart stop. The sandwich with Mark's name on it was still there, perfectly intact, as if waiting for him to return to finish his selection. Alex backed away slowly, but before he could leave, he heard a low, shuffling sound. It was the automatic door opening. When Alex looked at the entrance, he saw a man enter. He was tall, with a faded jacket and a hat that shadowed his face. The man slowly walked up to the counter and stopped, without saying a word. Alex tried to speak, but his voice broke. He knew, somehow, that this man was no ordinary customer. The man looked directly at the sandwich on the counter and, with a deliberate movement, pointed at Alex, as if expecting him to do something. Alex realized that the cycle was getting ready to start again, but this time he was in the place of the one watching. He was no longer the victim. He was now part of the system, trapped in the restaurant, condemned to watch as new entrants faced the same impossible choices. The man at the counter slowly turned, and Alex saw something that made him freeze. The man's face began to change, taking on Jess's features. For an instant, he saw the pain and despair in her eyes before the man disappeared completely. In the days that followed, Alex remained at Subway, unable to leave. He watched as new customers came in, but none of them seemed to notice the strangeness of the place. One night, while cleaning the tables, he saw something in the glass of the front door. It was his own reflection again, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him, shadows began to form, each carrying the features of those who had disappeared before him. When he turned around, the store was empty, but he knew they were there, waiting patiently. In another city, hundreds of miles away, a new Subway has opened. It was modern, well-lit, and attracted dozens of customers daily. However, in the back area, there was a door that no one seemed to notice. And behind the counter, in a discreet display case, there was a tray with a sandwich that no one ordered, but which was always there. Alex knew the cycle would continue, and he was now part of it, watching and waiting for the next victim. Before we go any further, if you like my content like the video, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments what time you dare to listen to these macabre stories. Now, without more interruptions, let's move on to the next story. In the heart of a small town in the state of Ohio, a subway located in an old historic building drew attention, not only for its worn-out architecture, but for its unusually heavy atmosphere. Locals avoided the place, claiming there was something strange there, but the owners insisted on keeping the restaurant open. That night, during the night shift, only 2 employees were in the store: Grace, the manager, known for her practicality and skepticism, and Tyler, a student who did the work only out of necessity. The night was quiet, with no customers, and the silence was broken only by the sound of the buzzing fluorescent lights and the light rain tapping against the windows. At 2:30 a.m., something unusual happened. The store's automatic system, which used to turn off lights in less used areas, began flashing erratically. Grace went to check the breaker, while Tyler stayed at the counter, scrolling through his cell phone. When Grace opened the back door, where the electrical panel was located, she found something that shouldn't be there: an old, rusty chair, positioned right in the center of the room. As he approached, he noticed that the chair was facing the wall, where words were scrawled in something dark red. "You shouldn't be here." She took a step back, but when she turned around, the door closed on its own, leaving her in the dark. Grace, trapped in the back room, tried to open the door, but it seemed locked from the inside, even though there was no visible lock. The air was freezing, and the buzzing lights in the restaurant seemed louder and closer. The chair in the center of the room was now facing her, even though no one was there to move it. Meanwhile, at the counter, Tyler began to feel something strange. The normally pleasant, strong smell of fresh bread had changed to something metallic, almost like blood. He looked around, trying to identify the source, but everything seemed normal. It was then that he heard a distant sound, like shuffling footsteps, coming from the hallway that led to the bathroom. Tyler called for Grace, but there was no response. He started to approach the hallway, but the sound stopped abruptly. When he looked in the mirror above the sink, he saw something that made his heart stop. His reflection wasn't there. Instead, the mirror showed the chair in the back room, with someone sitting in it, even though the room was empty. The lights in the entire restaurant suddenly went out, plunging the place into almost absolute darkness. Tyler tried to use his cell phone's flashlight, but the device wouldn't turn on. He started walking toward the back room to check on Grace, but when he got there, he found the door ajar. Inside the room, the words on the wall had changed. Now they said, "Hunger never ends." The chair was empty, but there were marks on the floor around it, as if someone had dragged their feet while sitting. Grace was missing. Tyler returned to the counter, trying to remain calm, but something was wrong. The tables and chairs in the dining area had been rearranged in a circular pattern, all facing the center of the room. In the middle, where there was nothing before, was a metal tray with a single sandwich on it. He tried to ignore it and call the police, but the landline was completely dead. That was when he heard a low sound, like a whisper, coming from the tray. He approached slowly, but when he tried to touch the sandwich, the air around him became heavy, almost suffocating. In the reflection of the window, he saw something standing behind him. He was a tall, thin figure with an indistinct silhouette, but with shining eyes that seemed to pierce his soul. He turned sharply, but there was no one there. Tyler realized that something was altering the reality around him. The walls seemed closer, the ceiling lower, and the air was filled with a foul smell. He tried to leave through the front door, but it wouldn't open, as if it were sealed from the inside. It was then that he heard Grace's voice, faintly calling out to him. The voice was coming from the refrigerator area, but when he got there, he only found her reflection in the glass. However, in the reflection, she seemed to be screaming, as if she was trapped on the other side. The clock on the wall began to spin rapidly, stopping at 2:33, even though the actual time was much later. Tyler realized he was trapped in a cycle, as if the restaurant was manipulating time to trap him there. In the back of the restaurant, Tyler found a small cabinet he had never noticed before. Inside was a pile of old documents, apparently left by the building's previous owners. Among them, one note caught his attention. "This place is cursed with hunger. Those who enter never leave the same." He leafed through the papers and found a log of disappearances associated with the restaurant, all during the night shift. Tyler realized that Grace and he weren't the first to face this, and they probably wouldn't be the last. Suddenly, the lights came back on, but with a red tint. In the reflection of the window, Tyler saw something that made him freeze. He and Grace were sitting at opposite tables, eating the same sandwich. But their faces were different, empty, without eyes, as if they were no longer themselves. Tyler felt something move behind him. He turned and saw the tall figure again, this time closer. The creature had no face, just a featureless head and long arms that almost touched the ground. She leaned toward him, as if examining him, before pointing to the tray in the center of the restaurant. The message was clear: eat or face something much worse. Tyler tried to resist, but when he looked at the tray, he saw that the sandwich now had Grace's name written on it. He realized that his choice wasn't just about himself, it would decide her fate as well. Tyler was still, staring at the sandwich on the tray. Grace's name, engraved on the packaging with something that looked like blood, pulsed lightly, as if it were alive. He knew this wasn't just a meal, it was a choice. A choice that could either doom Grace or save her. The tall, faceless figure stood still, watching him. Despite his immobility, Tyler felt her presence pressing down on him, like an invisible force sucking the air out of him. Suddenly, a low, shuffling sound echoed through the restaurant. The chairs around the tray began to move on their own, scraping the floor as they formed a tighter circle around the central table. The shadows on the walls grew thicker, almost solid, and began to get closer. The clock on the wall, which had previously been stopped, began to turn again, but instead of moving forward, it went backwards. The sound of the hands echoed loudly, accompanying the increase in tension in the environment. Tyler noticed that, with each turn of the clock, the shadows on the walls became clearer, taking on human shapes. He recognized some of them. They were faces he had seen in the old documents in the closet, people who had disappeared from the restaurant decades ago. Her eyes, empty and lifeless, stared at him, but her lips whispered in unison, "Choice." Out of nowhere, Tyler heard Grace's voice calling out to him again. She seemed close, but at the same time distant, as if she were trapped somewhere else. He looked around, trying to locate the source, but all he saw was her reflection in the glass of the display case. In the reflection, Grace was sitting on the chair in the back room, motionless, with her head lolling to the side. Blood ran from his eyes, forming words on the ground around him. "Save me or join me." Tyler knew the shadowy figure was testing his resolve. The faceless figure began to move, his shuffling footsteps echoing through the restaurant. She wasn't walking towards Tyler, but rather towards the sandwich on the tray. With its elongated arms, it pointed at him and then slowly turned its head, as if it was staring at Tyler without eyes. The restaurant began to shake slightly, and the lights, already red, began to flash with greater intensity. Tyler realized time was running out. He looked at the sandwich again and felt an irresistible urge to touch it, as if something was invading his mind and controlling his actions. Before Tyler could decide, another figure appeared in the window's reflection. It was Grace, but she wasn't alone. Beside her was something even more disturbing, a distorted version of Tyler. The reflection of the distorted Tyler appeared to be smiling, but his smile was too wide, his teeth were pointy, and his face was unnaturally elongated. He held the same sandwich on the tray and gestured for the real Tyler to join him. The surrounding space began to change again. The walls seemed to stretch and bend, creating impossible angles. The tables and chairs floated lightly in the air, while the floor seemed to be sinking into liquid darkness. Tyler felt the entire restaurant pulsate, as if it were alive. He realized that this wasn't just a building, it was a trap, a place that captured and consumed those who dared to stay too long. Finally, Tyler approached the tray. The faceless figure stopped moving, as if patiently waiting for his decision. The surrounding shadows were so close now that he could feel the cold emanating from them, like ice touching his skin. He picked up the sandwich with Grace's name on it, holding it in his hands. For a moment, he thought about destroying it, but before he could act, the figure stepped forward. The pressure around him increased, almost crushing him. At that moment, Tyler heard Grace's voice again. This time, she wasn't asking for help, she was begging him to let her go. With tears streaming down his face, Tyler made the decision. He placed the sandwich back on the tray and took a step back. The shadows stopped moving for a moment, as if confused, but the faceless figure tilted its head in approval. The tray began to glow with an intense light, and Tyler saw Grace's reflection slowly disappearing from the glass of the display case. He knew he had chosen to save himself at her expense. When the light disappeared, the restaurant returned to normal. The walls were clean, the tables were organized, and the lights shined normally. The clock showed 3:45, and the rain outside had stopped. But Grace was no longer there. Tyler was alone in the restaurant, but he knew that wasn't the end. He looked at the counter and saw a new tray with another sandwich, this time with his own name engraved on it. He realized that his choice hadn't broken the cycle, just the prolonged one. The restaurant seemed to be back to normal, but Tyler knew that nothing was truly the same as before. The silence in the room was overwhelming, filled with a sense of invisible vigilance. On the counter, the new tray with the sandwich bearing his name was illuminated by a beam of light that shouldn't be there. He stood still, staring at the object, feeling that his previous choice had brought him to the point of no return. The restaurant was not just a physical space, it was an entity, a predator that manipulated the fears and emotions of those who entered. Tyler tried to ignore the sandwich and find another way out. He went to the front door and tried to open it again, but the handle was stuck, as if welded to the metal. The window in the door reflected his image, but something was wrong. His reflection was smiling, a wide, unsettling smile that didn't match his real face. When he looked away, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. It wasn't a normal human walk. It was slow, dragging, like something heavy being moved. He quickly turned around, but there was no one there. The shadows that were once on the walls began to form again. They rose like columns of liquid darkness, taking on humanoid shapes. Tyler felt the air cool drastically as the figures approached, each bringing an overwhelming presence. He knew the restaurant was playing him. The new tray was an ultimatum, but also a trap. He could give in to the urge to grab the sandwich, or try to break the cycle in some way. But with each passing moment, the shadows drew closer, making the decision more difficult. Tyler tried to remember everything he had read in the old documents he had found. The message about eternal hunger echoed in his mind. He began to realize that the restaurant wasn't just a haunted place. It was a mechanism, a cycle of consumption that required constant sacrifices to continue existing. As he pondered, the ground began to transform. The clean tiles of the subway cracked, and a black substance began to emerge from the cracks. The material moved like a viscous liquid, forming symbols and patterns that he recognized from the walls of the previous hallway. In the center of the restaurant, where there had previously been tables and chairs, a large circle began to form, filled with red lights that pulsed in sync with your breathing. The faceless figure reappeared in the circle, but this time she was not alone. All around her, smaller shapes began to emerge from the ground, each with vaguely familiar features. Tyler realized that they were distorted reflections of people who had disappeared from the restaurant over the years. Their bodies were twisted at impossible angles, but their eyes stared at him with a mixture of pleading and anger. Among the figures, Tyler saw Grace. She was standing, but her face was blank, eyeless, expressionless. She raised her hand slowly, pointing at him, as if blaming him for her condition. Tyler tried to talk to her, but his voice seemed to disappear into thin air. He felt the crushing weight of guilt pile up as the surrounding figures began to form a circle, slowly moving towards him. Suddenly, the faceless figure extended his arm, pointing at the sandwich on the tray. The voice that emerged from the surrounding darkness was low but clear. "You know what to do. Only one needs to stay." Tyler understood the meaning. The cycle required sacrifice, but perhaps he could game the system. He picked up the sandwich and, instead of eating it, threw it into the circle on the floor. For a brief moment, the restaurant stopped shaking, and the figures hesitated. The faceless figure tilted its head, as if confused, before making a screeching sound that made Tyler fall to his knees. The walls of the restaurant began to shatter, revealing an infinite darkness beyond them. Tyler saw flashes of images, scenes of people entering the restaurant over the years, only to never leave. He saw Grace, Mark, and other people all being consumed by the cycle. He also saw himself, stuck in the same place, making impossible choices over and over again. The ground beneath him began to sink, and Tyler realized that his attempt to cheat the cycle had only accelerated its collapse. He tried to run to the exit, but the door was shrouded in shadows, blocking any possibility of escape. The surrounding figures began to dissolve, their distorted forms returning to the black ground. Grace was the last to disappear, but before disappearing completely, she looked directly at Tyler with her empty eyes, as if saying something he couldn't hear. The faceless figure advanced, and Tyler knew he had no more time. The entire restaurant was filled with a red glow, and he felt his body being pulled into the circle. When the glow disappeared, the restaurant was empty again. The tables were set, the lights were shining normally, and the clock said 6 a.m. sharp. Outside, a car pulled up to the subway, and a new customer walked in, looking around curiously. The restaurant looked completely normal, except for one thing: the tray on the counter, which now had a sandwich with the newly arrived customer's name on it. The cycle continued. Sunlight was beginning to illuminate Subway's exterior, casting a false aura of normalcy over the restaurant. However, the interior remained charged with an invisible presence, as if the space had absorbed the events of the previous night. A customer came in, a truck driver with a tired look. He stopped at the counter and looked at the tray with a sandwich that looked like it had just been prepared. He frowned when he saw his name engraved on the packaging. Confused, he called for someone, but there was no attendant. He hesitated before touching the sandwich, but when he looked at the clock, he noticed something strange. It wasn't moving. In the back, a shadow began to form. It was Tyler, but he wasn't the same anymore. His form was a mixture of the faceless figure and himself. He was dressed in his subway uniform, standing still, watching the new customer with blank eyes. Tyler was now part of the restaurant. He was the new guardian of the cycle, forever trapped in a place that manipulated time and choices. The truck driver sat at a table, confused but feeling a strange pressure that made him stay in place. As he looked around, he saw something reflected in the window. Shadowy, distorted figures, motionless but watching. The lights began to flicker, and the restaurant shook slightly again. The chairs around him began to move on their own, and the air grew colder. He tried to leave, but the door was already locked. Over the next few days, new customers came and went, each experiencing small moments of strangeness, but always returning to their routines, as if nothing had happened. But for those who stayed too late or chose the wrong path, the cycle repeated itself. They disappeared without a trace, becoming part of the shadows that filled the restaurant. In the kitchen, Tyler continued to watch, feeling the restaurant's eternal hunger grow. He knew that eventually he would be forced to participate again, driving the cycle forward, even against his will. In another state, a new subway opened its doors. It was modern, bright, and looked completely normal. However, among the shiny new equipment was a tray with an untouched sandwich. The employees didn't know how the tray had gotten there, but they ignored it, continuing their daily tasks. On the first night of operation, one of the workers looked at the reflection in the window and saw something that shouldn't be there. A familiar but blank face watching him from the other side of the glass. The cycle continued,